For 5 years, every Friday, I would come home and see the same delivery man handing the same black box to my son. Every time I asked, he said it was sensitive research samples that needed to be stored at home. Then one Friday night, a different delivery man showed up. He slipped an envelope into my hand and whispered, "Check under your son's bed when he's asleep." I didn't understand, but something told me I had to look. That night I did. When I opened the steel box, I froze. And in that moment, I realized the person I trusted most was the one who had planned everything with meticulous precision. I'm really glad you're here. Before we go, further drop a comment and tell me where you're watching, from your city or country. I'd love to know who's listening. And just a small note, this story includes fictional elements for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to real people or places is purely coincidental. But the message behind it may still resonate. The first thing I noticed when I turned onto Birchwood Lane that evening was the light. It was the kind of soft amber glow that only comes in March in Portland, the sun already halfway behind the West Hills, painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and pale gold. After 35 years of rushing home from the pharmacy counting inventory in my head and mentally calculating the next morning's orders, I had finally learned to notice things like that. The color of the sky, the way the neighbor's oak tree held its last dead leaves, like it just couldn't bring itself to let go. Retirement will do that to you. My name is Harold Mercer. I'm 68 years old, and I live at 14 Birchwood Lane, Portland Heights, Oregon, a quiet 2-story colonial that my late wife Eleanor and I picked out together back in 1988, when the neighborhood still had more mud than sidewalk. I spent 40 years building Mercer's Pharmacy from a single rented counter on Morrison Street into 3 locations across the city. Then 4 years ago, I sold everything, hung up my white coat, and told myself I'd earned the right to be ordinary. Most days, ordinary looks like this: a slow morning with black coffee and the newspaper, an afternoon walk through Washington Park. And on Fridays, my favorite day of the week, an evening of 5-card draw with Frank Bellows at his place on Cedar Ridge. Frank has been my closest friend for going on 22 years. We met at a neighborhood association meeting that neither of us wanted to attend, bonded over bad coffee and worse speeches, and have been playing cards every Friday since. He is 70 years old, retired from the Postal Service, and the only man I know who can lose 4 hands in a row and still convince you he's winning. Those Friday evenings at Frank's table kept me sane through Eleanor's illness, through the exhaustion of selling the business, through all the quiet that comes after a life spent being busy. After cards, I'd drive the 12 minutes home to Birchwood Lane, where Ethan, my son, 34 years old, a research pharmacist at a firm downtown, usually had dinner waiting. That was our routine. That was our life. And it was a good one, or so I believed. It was the 3rd Friday of March 2025 when I pulled into the driveway and saw it again. The figure standing at our front door. A man in a gray jacket. I couldn't tell you much more than that. Medium height, a dark cap pulled low, carrying a sealed black box roughly the size of a large dictionary, maybe a little wider. He had his back to me as I stepped out of the car, and by the time I reached the front walk, Ethan had already opened the door and taken the box from his hands. A few words exchanged. A nod. Then the man turned and walked back toward a plain white van parked at the curb, and I caught only a glimpse of his profile before he climbed in and drove away. I stood there for a moment, watching the taillights disappear around the corner. Same gray jacket, I thought. Same black box. Same Friday. "Hey, Dad!" Ethan held the door open for me, the box already tucked under one arm like it weighed nothing. He was dressed casually worn jeans, a faded university sweatshirt, but there was something precise about the way he held that box. Careful. Deliberate. How was Frank's? "He cheated again," I said. "Lost $30, but I'm convinced he marked the deck." Ethan laughed. It was a good laugh, easy warm, the kind that fills a room. He was a tall young man, lean like his mother had been, with her same dark eyes and the habit of tucking his chin slightly when he was thinking. I had always been proud of him, still was standing there in the doorway. "What's in the box?" I asked. Same question, same casual tone. He didn't even pause. "Lab specimens," he said, moving toward the hallway closet. Research samples from the partner facility. They need specific temperature management during transport, so I take delivery here instead of the lab. You know how it is, chain of custody protocols, documentation requirements. He slid the box onto the closet shelf next to his winter coats and turned back to me with a small shrug. Nothing to worry about, Dad. And I nodded, because that was the answer he always gave and because it always made sense. I had actually looked into it once. This was maybe 2 years back, when the deliveries first started to feel like something worth noticing, rather than something to walk past. I called Dr. Patricia Owens, an old colleague of mine who had spent 30 years in clinical pharmaceutical research before retiring to Bend. I didn't make it strange. Just mentioned it, casually said, my son was a research pharmacist and I was curious about how specimen transport worked in the field. She told me it was completely standard. Temperature-sensitive compounds, biological samples, control substances used in trials, all of it requires strict handling, private courier services. Home delivery was not unheard of for senior researchers managing sensitive projects. If he works in clinical development, Harold, that's just Tuesday, she said, and laughed. That was all I needed to hear. That evening, Ethan made pot roast. He was a good cook, better than I ever was, and the house smelled like rosemary and slow-braised beef when I settled into my chair at the kitchen table. We talked about the Blazers, about the pothole on Burnside that had been there since November, about whether Frank had actually cheated or whether I was just a sore loser. It was ordinary. It was warm. It was everything I had told myself retirement was supposed to be. Later, I washed the dishes while Ethan disappeared into his room, and I stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark yard at the motion sensor light, blinking on and off over the back fence. And I genuinely felt at peace. That was the gift of those Friday evenings. Not the cards, not the pot roast, not even the comfortable silence of a house I'd lived in for decades. It was the feeling that things were settled, that the hard chapters were behind me, and what was left was just the gentle, unremarkable rhythm of living. 5 years of the same Friday. 5 years of the same gray jacket, the same black box, the same smooth answer from my son. I told myself there was nothing to it. I was very good at telling myself things. To understand what happened, you need to understand what I built and who I believed I built it for. That thought came to me later, much later, when I had more time than I wanted to sit alone and think. But it starts here with the beginning of everything long before the black box and the gray jacket and the questions I should have asked sooner. Mercer's Pharmacy opened its doors on the 15th of February 1990 in a narrow rented storefront on Morrison Street in downtown Portland. I was 33 years old. I had a pharmacist's license, $11,000 in savings, a secondhand cash register, and the kind of stubborn optimism that either builds something or breaks you completely. For the first 2 years, it nearly broke me. I worked 7 days a week. I filled prescriptions at 6 in the morning and balanced ledgers past midnight. I learned every customer's name, every medication they were on, every refill date. Mrs. Patterson with her heart medication every 28th of the month. Old Gerald Webb, who came in every Tuesday for his arthritis supplements and stayed 40 minutes whether you had time for him or not. I wasn't just running a pharmacy. I was running a small, careful piece of the neighborhood, and I took that seriously in the way you only can when it's everything you have. Eleanor came into the store in the spring of 1992. She wasn't a customer. She was looking for work, had a background in health administration, a sharp mind, and absolutely no tolerance for inefficiency. She reorganized my entire inventory system in her first week without being asked. And when I pointed out she had rearranged everything without my permission, she looked at me calmly and said, "You can put it back if you want, but this way makes sense." I didn't put it back. We were married in June of 1993. Late starters, both of us. Eleanor was 35, I was 36, and we had both spent our best years building careers instead of lives. We used to joke that we were proof you could do things out of order and still get them right. Ethan was born in the spring of 1991. No, let me correct myself. I'm getting ahead of things. Eleanor came first. Then came the years of building together, the slow expansion from one location to 2, then 3. And then Ethan arrived in the early months of their marriage, a son they hadn't entirely planned for, but welcomed with the kind of quiet, certain joy that doesn't need a party to be real. He was our only child. Eleanor's complicated pregnancy meant there would be no others, and so every hope, every Friday evening, reading to him in the back office. Every carefully saved dollar flowed toward that one boy. I remember the afternoon I brought him to the Morrison Street store when he was about 7 years old. He was small for his age, serious-faced, the way some children are always watching before he spoke. I had a spare lab coat hanging on the back of the office door, adult-sized, which meant it swallowed him completely, the sleeves drooping past his hands, the hem dragging on the floor. He put it on without asking, and stood behind the prescription counter with his hands folded, watching the customers come and go, like he was already responsible for them. Eleanor took a photograph. I still have it in a frame on my bedroom dresser. A 7-year-old boy drowning in a white coat, looking at the world like he already knew exactly what his place in it would be. I thought I knew what that photograph meant. For a long time, I was certain I did. Eleanor was the soul of that pharmacy in every way that mattered. I was the pharmacist, the license holder, the one whose name was on the window. But she was the reason people came back. She remembered details: a customer's daughter's recital, a supplier's birthday, the particular brand of antacid that old Mr. Hannigan preferred over the generic. She had a gift for people that I simply didn't possess, a warmth that made the store feel like something more than a place to pick up a prescription. She also had a sharpness that I sometimes failed to appreciate enough. There were moments scattered across the years, easy to overlook, at the time when I would catch Eleanor watching Ethan with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not worry exactly, not disapproval. Something quieter than that, and more careful. A stillness behind her eyes that she never put into words and that I never thought to ask about. I told myself it was nothing. The ordinary anxiety of a mother with an only child projecting forward into all the things that could go wrong. I was good at explaining things away. She passed in the autumn of 2017. Pancreatic cancer, swift and merciless, the way the particular illness tends to be. 4 months from diagnosis to the end. I was with her every day, and then one morning I wasn't, and the store felt like a building I no longer recognized. I kept working for 3 more years. I think it was the only way I knew how to keep moving. Then in 2020, I sold all 3 locations to a regional chain. For a fair price, shook the new owner's hand, and walked out of Morrison Street for the last time, with nothing in my hands and nowhere I needed to be. The proudest day of my life, after Ethan's birth, was the afternoon I watched my son accept his doctoral degree from the College of Pharmacy at Oregon Health and Science University. He was 28 years old. He had worked for it with a kind of focused, relentless discipline that I recognized because I had tried to teach it to him, and for a moment in that auditorium, I felt something rare and complete. I had started with $11,000 and a rented storefront. My son had a doctorate and a career in pharmaceutical research. He was brilliant, careful, successful. Everything I had aimed for on his behalf had landed exactly where I hoped. What I didn't understand, couldn't have understood, standing there in that auditorium with tears I was too proud to let fall, was that the very thing I had spent my life building had handed him every tool he would one day need to dismantle me. I believed that everything I had constructed would keep us both safe. I had no idea that belief was the most dangerous thing about me. Memory is a strange thing. You can live alongside something for years, see it every week, file it away under normal, move on. And then one day the whole picture shifts, and suddenly every ordinary detail you ignored starts glowing like it was marked all along. That's how it is when I think about the man in the gray jacket. I couldn't tell you when I first noticed him, not precisely. Somewhere in the early months of 2020, after Ethan had been at Nexogen Research for about a year, the Friday deliveries began. At first I registered them the way you register the mail carrier or the meter reader, a peripheral presence part of the background rhythm of the neighborhood. Someone who belonged to a world of logistics and schedules that had nothing to do with me. He drove a plain white cargo van, no markings on the side. He always arrived between 6:15 and 6:30 in the evening, right around the time I was pulling into the driveway after cards at Frank's. The timing was so consistent it almost felt choreographed. Over the years, I came to half expect him, the way you half expect the last light of a Friday afternoon, not consciously just as part of the shape of the day. He was medium height, solidly built somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s. He wore the same style of gray zip-up jacket almost every visit, not the exact same jacket I assumed, but close enough that they blurred together in my memory into one single garment. Dark cap. Work boots. He moved efficiently the way people do when they've made the same trip hundreds of times and stopped needing to think about it. What I noticed eventually, the way you notice something only after it's happened enough times, was that he never quite looked at me. Not in a rude way, not in a way that would have raised any flags. He simply kept his eyes on the box, on the doorstep, on whatever needed doing. He'd nod if I passed him on the front walk, the brief professional nod of a man who is working and knows it. But he never held my gaze, never initiated conversation. He'd hand the box to Ethan, exchange a few quiet words. I was never close enough to hear and be back in that van and down the street before I'd finished getting my keys out of my pocket. Over 5 years, I probably stood within 30 feet of that man, over 200 times. I knew the cut of his jacket better than I knew his face. Ethan had an explanation for every season. The first year, it was temperature-sensitive compound samples being transferred between research facilities, standard protocol for a Phase 1 trial, he said, required courier delivery to a secured residential address to maintain chain of custody. The second year, the story shifted slightly. The compounds had progressed to a new testing phase, and the documentation requirements had increased, which was why the boxes seemed heavier. By the third year, Ethan mentioned something about a partnership with a pharmaceutical firm in Seattle that had changed the delivery logistics. The fourth year, he told me the research division had restructured, and the home delivery arrangement was temporary while the new secure lab space was being certified. Each explanation was different. Each one was fluent, detailed, and loaded with just enough technical language to feel entirely credible to a man who had spent 40 years in the pharmaceutical trade. That was the thing, I suppose. I wasn't a suspicious man by nature, but I also wasn't a naive one. I had filled controlled substance prescriptions for decades. I understood research protocols, compound handling, regulatory requirements. I knew the vocabulary. And every time Ethan used that vocabulary, chain of custody, phase 2, parameters, cold chain, integrity, something in me relaxed because it sounded like the world I had come from. It sounded like the world I had handed to him. Frank asked me once, somewhere around the third year, whether it seemed odd. We were at his kitchen table, cards in hand, and I must have mentioned the delivery in passing. He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses with that expression. He gets the one that means he's thinking something he's not sure you want to hear. "You ever look inside one of those boxes?" he asked. No, I said. It's not my research. Frank set his cards down for a moment. Then he picked them up again. "No, I guess it isn't," he said, and we moved on. I have thought about that exchange more times than I can count. There was one afternoon, a Friday in the summer of 2023. July, I think. The kind of heavy Pacific Northwest heat that makes the whole city feel slightly wrong, when the man in the gray jacket paused at the end of our front walk. Ethan had already taken the box inside. The van was running at the curb. The man had turned to leave, and then he stopped. He stood with his back to me for a moment, and then he turned around, and for the first time in 3 years of weekly visits, he looked directly at me. Not the professional nod, not the peripheral glance. He actually looked at me, and there was something in his face I didn't know how to read. A tension around the jaw, a slight furrow between the brows, the expression of a man carrying something that doesn't quite fit inside him anymore. His lips moved, just barely, like the first word of something had made it as far as his mouth and then lost its nerve. Then Ethan appeared in the doorway behind me and called out something casual. "Everything okay out there?" And the man looked away, gave a single nod toward the street, and walked back to his van. I stood on the front walk for a moment after he drove off, holding my car keys, feeling the heat press down on the back of my neck. Then I went inside and helped set the table, and forgot about it entirely by the time dinner was on the plates. That's what I told myself it was. Nothing. A tired courier at the end of a long week. A trick of the July heat on an old man's imagination. Looking back now, I think he wanted to tell me something. I think he was trying in the only quiet way he knew how. But there are doors that stay locked until the person on the other side finally decides to open them. He wasn't ready yet, and God help me, wasn't looking. There are doors that stay locked until the person on the other side finally decides to open them. That Friday, someone knocked. I had been thinking about Frank's comment on the drive home, the offhand question he'd tossed across the card table 3 years ago, and never followed up on. You ever look inside one of those boxes? I hadn't thought about it in months, but something about the drive that evening, the way the sky had gone flat and gray over the West Hills, the way the radio felt too loud and I'd switched it off, put me in a reflective mood, the kind that surfaces without warning in the late afternoon of a man's 68th year. I turned onto Birchwood Lane at 6:20, the same as always. And that's when I saw him. He was standing at the front door when I pulled in a figure I registered immediately as wrong, in the particular way your brain flags something before your eyes have finished processing it. Not the gray jacket, not the dark cap and work boots, and the efficient stillness of a man who has made this trip 200 times. This man was different, and I knew it before I'd even cut the engine. He wore a blue jacket, a clean structured zip-up, in a shade somewhere between navy and slate, the kind of thing that looks almost casual until you notice how precisely it fits. He was taller than the regular delivery man, broader through the shoulders, somewhere in his mid-40s. He stood with the kind of composed, deliberate stillness that I had seen before, not in couriers, but in people who were used to waiting, used to watching. He held the same style of sealed black box under one arm. On the surface, everything looked routine, but his eyes were different. When I stepped out of the car and started up the front walk, he glanced over at me, and the look he gave me was not the professional non-look of a man doing a job. It was direct, measured, the focused attention of someone who had been waiting specifically for me, who had calculated exactly when I would arrive, and who had something prepared. It was the look of a man about to hand someone a grenade and needing to be absolutely sure it landed in the right hands. I almost stopped walking. Instead, I kept moving the way you do when instinct tells you to behave normally and your body obeys before your mind catches up. Ethan appeared at the door right on schedule. He pulled it open the way he always did, unhurried, easy, already dressed down for the evening. He and the man in the blue jacket exchanged the usual quiet transaction. Box transferred a small electronic signature device, produced Ethan's thumb on the screen. A receipt torn off and folded into Ethan's hand. 45 seconds start to finish. Whatever was said between them was too low for me to catch. Then Ethan looked up, spotted me on the walk, and smiled. "Hey, Dad, you're going to get wet. It's about to open up." He wasn't wrong. I could feel it already, that particular Pacific Northwest pressure drop that comes in the minutes before a serious rain. The air had gone thick and close, and the streetlights at the end of the block had flicked on early. "Hey, be right in," I said. Ethan nodded and stepped back inside with the box, leaving the front door half open behind him. The delivery man turned to go, and that was the moment. He didn't move toward the van. He moved toward me. It was done with the precision of something rehearsed. He closed the distance between us in 3 or 4 quiet steps, and as he passed me on the narrow front walk, his right hand came up and gripped my forearm gently, but with the kind of firmness that meant stop. And with his other hand, he pressed something against my palm, small, flat, the weight of a few folded sheets of paper inside an envelope. He leaned in close, and his voice was barely above a breath. "Tonight, Mr. Mercer." His eyes stayed forward, not on me, the way a man talks when he needs to look like he isn't talking. "Check under your son's bed when he's asleep. You need to see what's there." Then he straightened, turned slightly, and loud enough to carry to the front door if anyone was watching, pointed down the street in the direction of the crossroad, as though he'd been giving me directions. A natural gesture, the kind that means nothing to a person watching from inside a house. He walked back to his vehicle without looking at me again. I stood on the front walk with a brown envelope in my hand and the rain starting to come down. It arrived the way Portland rain always does, not dramatically, but with a kind of steady, patient certainty, as though it had been planning this all afternoon and saw no reason to rush. The first drops hit my shoulders and the top of my head, and I stood there and let them, because my legs had made a decision, independent of my brain, to simply not move yet. The envelope was plain. No markings on the outside. My name was not written on it. It was just a rectangle of brown paper, slightly warm from being held, and inside it I could feel the distinct shape of folded pages. From inside the house, Ethan's voice came through the half-open door, easy and familiar. "Dad, you're getting soaked out there. Come on in." I looked at the door, at the warm light spilling through the gap, at my son's silhouette moving in the kitchen, doing whatever he did on Friday evenings, checking the oven, opening a cabinet, being ordinary. I closed my hand around the envelope. "Coming," I called. I slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket against my chest, where it pressed flat and quiet against my ribs, and I climbed the front steps and pushed the door open and stepped into the warmth of the house I had lived in for 37 years. I walked through that door carrying something I didn't yet have a name for, something that felt for the first time in 5 years like the beginning of the truth. The kitchen smelled exactly the way it always did on Friday evenings. Rosemary, slow-braised beef, the faint sweetness of caramelized onions that had been sitting in the oven since mid-afternoon. It was a smell I had come home to dozens of times over the years, warm and unhurried, the smell of a house where someone had been taking care of things while you were away. Standing in the hallway, shrugging off my jacket and hanging it on the hook by the door, I recognized that smell as something I had always taken for granted. That thought arrived without warning, and it landed harder than I expected. I smoothed the front of my jacket before hanging it, made sure the inside pocket lay flat, made sure nothing showed. Chicken or beef? I called toward the kitchen, because that was what I always said when I came home to a cooked dinner and wanted Ethan to know I noticed. "Beef," he called back. "Same as last month. You always forget." "I always hope," I said. He laughed. I heard the oven door open and close. I went to wash my hands. The table was set the way it always was, on Fridays too. Placemats, the good ceramic bowls. A basket of bread in the center that Ethan had picked up from the bakery on Burnside on his way home from the lab. He was particular about bread. Eleanor had been the same way, and I had always found a quiet comfort in that small piece of her living on, in habits he probably didn't know he'd inherited. He set the pot roast down between us and pulled out his chair with the ease of a man who had done this 10,000 times. "How was Franken?" he asked. "Stubborn," I said. "He's convinced that reading my expression gives him an edge. Why does it?" "Tonight, apparently not." Ethan smiled and reached for the bread. He was in good spirits, animated in the particular way he got when a project at work was going well, that restless, slightly accelerated energy that I had watched in him since he was a teenager finishing a school paper at midnight. He talked about a trial phase that was showing promising early results, a colleague who had submitted a paper to a journal and gotten a favorable initial review. I nodded in the right places. I asked the right questions. I ate my pot roast, and the entire time I watched him. The way you watch a painting when someone has told you there's a hidden image inside it differently than before, with a new kind of attention that you can't unfocus once it's been switched on. Every gesture, the way he held his fork, the way he looked up when he laughed, the way he refilled my water glass without being asked an automatic courtesy so practiced it had become invisible. I had looked at this man across a dinner table for 34 years. I thought I knew every angle of his face. That evening, for the first time, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. It came midway through the meal the way it always did. Ethan stood cross to the kitchen counter and came back with a small amber prescription bottle that had lived next to the pepper grinder for the past several months. He set it down beside my bowl without ceremony. "Don't forget your vitamins, Dad." His voice was easy, warm, the voice of a son looking after his father. I picked up the bottle, shook 2 capsules into my palm, the standard evening dose Ethan had suggested, after I mentioned feeling more tired than usual back in the fall. He'd had them formulated specially, he'd told me, through a contact at the lab. A B-complex and magnesium blend tailored for men my age. It had seemed at the time like exactly the kind of thoughtful thing Ethan would do. I looked at the capsules in my palm. They were the same as always, smooth, off-white, unremarkable. The kind of thing a responsible son gives his aging father to keep him healthy. Ethan was already reaching for his water glass, his attention back on what he'd been saying about his colleague's paper. He wasn't watching me. He wasn't not watching me either, It was simply the natural inattention of a shared meal, the ordinary rhythm of two people eating together who have run out of need to monitor each other. I put one capsule in my mouth. The other I tucked into the space between my fingers, and my palm curled just enough to disappear. I reached for my water, took a sip, kept my face entirely still. "That's good," I said in response to something Ethan had just said about the journal paper, and he nodded satisfied and kept talking. 40 minutes later, when I excused myself to use the bathroom, I wrapped the second capsule in a square of tissue and folded it into the small pocket of my trousers. One capsule, small enough to be undetectable, large enough I hoped to tell me something I wasn't ready to ask out loud. I didn't know yet what I would do with it, I just knew I needed it. After dinner, Ethan loaded the dishwasher while I sat in the living room with the television on a baseball preseason recap that I didn't hear a single word of. We talked a little more. He made chamomile tea and brought me a cup without being asked, and we sat together in the kind of easy silence that two people develop after years in the same house. The 10 o'clock news came on. He said goodnight just before 11. I sat in the darkened living room and listened to the house settle the familiar ticks and creaks of a structure that has been standing through Oregon winters for decades. The television threw blue light across the floor. The envelope sat on my lap, where I had placed it after retrieving my jacket from the hall hook, and I held it the way you hold something you're not sure you have the right to open. My hands were not steady. Outside, the rain had eased to a quiet drizzle. A car passed on Birchwood Lane, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling, and then it was gone. I had spent 68 years believing that the people who love you are the ones you can read without effort. That love makes people transparent. That a father who had watched his son grow from infancy to adulthood could not be sitting in the dark on a Friday night, afraid to know the truth about him. I sat there until the house went fully quiet, until the last sounds of Ethan moving in his room, the bathroom faucet, the soft close of a drawer faded and stopped. I waited another 30 minutes. When the light under his bedroom door finally went dark, I stood up from the chair, walked down the hallway, and pushed his door open. If you're still here, comment, "I'm still here," so I know you're with me. And tell me, if it were you, would you open that box and face whatever truth is waiting inside, or walk away and pretend you never saw anything? And just a small note, the next part of this story includes some fictional elements added for storytelling purposes, so it may not fully reflect real life if you'd rather not continue. You can stop here. Ethan's room was dark and still. I stood in the doorway for a moment, listening. The slow, even rhythm of his breathing, deep, unhurried, the breathing of a man with nothing on his conscience, came from the far side of the room, where his bed sat against the window. The curtains were drawn. A thin strip of light from the street lamp outside cut across the ceiling like a pale scar. I clicked on the small flashlight I'd taken from the kitchen drawer, the one we kept for power outages, barely larger than a pen, and kept the beam low, pointed at the floor. The brown envelope had told me exactly where to look. Tucked inside, along with 2 folded pages of what I now understood to be instructions, was a single index card with 6 numbers written in a clean, precise hand, 419873. No explanation, no name. Just the numbers underlined once, and below them, a single line under the bed. Left side, against the wall. I crossed the room slowly, each step measured, placing my weight on the outer edges of my feet the way you learn to move silently in a house you've lived in long enough to know which floorboards to avoid. I reached the bed, crouched down, directed the flashlight beam into the space beneath the frame. The metal box was there. It was smaller than I expected, roughly the size of a shoebox, brushed steel, with a recessed combination lock set into the front panel. The kind of container that looks ordinary until you notice how solid it is, how precisely the seams are machined, the kind of thing built to hold documents that aren't meant to be found. I set the flashlight on the floor angled upward, lifted the box out with both hands, it was heavier than it looked, and set it on my knees. I entered the code, 419873. The lock released with a soft mechanical click that in the silence of that room sounded to me like a door being kicked open. The first thing I saw was my own name. Subject, Harold Mercer. DOB, March 14th, 1957. Trial designation NXG-7. Subject number 07. It was printed on the top sheet of a document bundle, secured with a black binder clip, clinical and precise, formatted like an internal research report. I turned the page, then the next. My hands were steady in the way hands sometimes go steady when the mind has moved past shock into something colder and more functional. The NXG-7 trial documentation ran to 11 pages. I didn't read every word that night. I couldn't not by flashlight, not on the floor of my son's bedroom while he slept 6 feet away. But I read enough. The compound was described as an experimental cognitive modulatory agent, still in undisclosed Phase 0 trials, not approved by any regulatory body, not registered in any public clinical database. The trial was being conducted under contract with Nexogen Corp., a private pharmaceutical research firm. The contract was attached $2 million payable in installments upon the successful completion of each trial phase. The subject's consent signature was on page 4. My signature, my name in handwriting that was almost mine, close enough to pass a casual glance, wrong enough now that I was looking, that I could see the slight difference in the way the R curved and the way the C sat too high on the baseline. I had signed thousands of documents in 40 years of running a business. I knew my own hand. That was not my hand. Below the trial documents was a delivery manifest, a grid of dates running from January 2020 through March 2025. Every Friday marked every shipment logged. The compound designated only as NXG-7 oral encapsulated delivery, confirmed dosage recorded. 61 months, 243 deliveries. I set that page down very carefully. The last item in the box was a notebook, slim black covered, the kind you find at any office supply store. On the inside cover, Ethan had written his initials in the corner, EM, the same neat printing he'd used since grade school. I opened it. The entries were dated weekly going back to late 2024. Each one was brief, clinical. Written not in the language of a son describing his father, but in the flat observational register of a researcher logging data points. Week 3. Subject 07 reports increased fatigue and mild joint discomfort, consistent with projected Phase 1 indicators. Dosage maintained. Week 7. Subject 07 shows first measurable cognitive delay in verbal recall, notable hesitation during casual conversation. Memory gaps widening as projected. Continuing per schedule. Week 11. Subject 07 asked about delivery contents again this evening. Response accepted without follow-up. Suggestibility index increasing. Phase 1 parameters met. Recommend Phase 2 advancement. Week 14. Subject 07 does not appear to retain short-term observations beyond 48 hours. Interaction patterns unchanged. No suspicion detected. Trial proceeding within acceptable parameters. I read every entry in that notebook. When I reached the last page, I closed it and held it in both hands and sat very still. Subject 07. Not Dad, not Father, not even Harold. Subject 07. A data point in a trial that had been running inside my own home, at my own dinner table, administered by my own son's hand for the better part of a year. And before that, 5 years of deliveries, each one carrying the compound that Ethan had been building toward. 5 years of preparation. 5 years of a Friday routine I had mistaken for loyalty. I thought about the amber bottle by the pepper grinder, the way he always handed it to me himself, the way I had thanked him for it. The capsule I had hidden in my trouser pocket felt suddenly like the most important object I had ever held. I replaced everything exactly as I had found it. The notebook, the documents, the manifest. I closed the lid and listened for the lock to catch, then slid the box back into position under the bed against the wall, left side. I retrieved the flashlight. I stood up slowly. Ethan hadn't moved. His breathing was the same. Slow, even, undisturbed. I walked back to the door without a sound. I sat in my own room for a long time after that, on the edge of my bed in the dark, with the 2 folded instruction pages from the envelope resting on the nightstand. I didn't turn on the lamp. I didn't need light to understand what I had just read. I didn't weep. There was something beyond weeping in what I felt, a stillness that goes all the way down past grief, past anger, into a place where the ordinary responses simply don't reach. Outside, the rain continued to fall on Portland, the way it always did in March, patient and different, asking nothing of anyone. Inside, something that had taken 68 years to build had come apart in a single breath. I didn't sleep. That's not quite accurate. I lay on top of the covers in my clothes with the lamp off and my eyes open, and the hours moved the way hours do when the mind refuses to stop working, slowly at first, then all at once. And then it was 5:43 in the morning, and the birds had started up outside, and Portland was turning that particular shade of gray-blue that comes just before the sun commits to rising. I had spent the night doing what I could not help doing, going back through everything. Not the documents, I didn't need to read those again. I had them memorized in the way you memorize something that hits with enough force. What I went back through was the years. The ordinary, unremarkable years of Friday evenings and shared dinners, and a son I had trusted absolutely. And I held each memory up like a photograph and looked at it from the other side. And almost every one of them looked different. The amber bottle by the pepper grinder. The way he always handed it to me himself. Don't forget your vitamins, Dad. At 6 o'clock exactly, I picked up my phone. The number in the envelope had been written below the instructions in the same clean, deliberate hand as the lock combination, a local area code, nothing else. I sat on the edge of my bed and dialed it, and it was answered on the second ring. Mr. Mercer. The voice was measured professional, the voice of a man who had been awake for some time and was expecting this call. I'm glad you called. Who are you? I said. My name is Ray Donovan. I'm a special agent with the FBI's Pharmaceutical Crimes Division based out of the Portland field office. A brief pause, not for effect, but for clarity. The pause of a man choosing his next words carefully. I've been investigating the activities of Nexogen Corp and their unlicensed trial program for the past 14 months. You are a part of that investigation, Mr. Mercer. Specifically, you are the reason I'm still on this case. I didn't say anything for a moment. You came to my door yesterday, I said. Yes. You could have knocked, talked to me directly. No, Donovan said. I couldn't, not at the house. He explained it plainly without drama. The possibility that the property had been fitted with audio monitoring equipment by parties connected to Ethan's arrangement with Nexogen. Standard precaution in cases involving pharmaceutical contract research. Any conversation inside the house or on the immediate property risked being recorded and flagged. The moment at the front gate, the few seconds between the delivery and the front door, was the only window he could reliably use. You handed me that envelope and walked away, I said. I needed you to find the box yourself. Anything I gave you directly would have chain of custody complications in court. Evidence you find independently in your own home is admissible in a way that a document handed to you by a federal agent is not. He paused again. I know this is a great deal to take in. Keep going, I said. He told me what he could. Ethan had entered into a private contract with Nexogen Corp approximately 14 months ago, though the groundwork, Donovan said, had likely begun much earlier. The compound being delivered and administered was NXG-7, an experimental cognitive agent that Nexogen had been developing outside of any approved regulatory channel. The trial required a long-term subject who could be monitored closely over an extended period without their knowledge. Ethan had provided that subject. The contract value was $2 million, structured in milestone payments, each payment released upon the confirmed progression of the trial to the next phase. He signed papers on my behalf, I said. I saw my signature. It wasn't mine. We know, Donovan said. Document forensics has already flagged the consent forms. That's a serious federal offense on its own, separate from the trial itself. Why haven't you arrested him? Because arresting Ethan now gets us Ethan, Donovan said. Waiting gets us Ethan Nexogen's leadership, the contract chain, and everyone involved in approving and funding an illegal human trial. He let that settle. Mr. Mercer, I need to ask you to continue your normal routine for a short period. Go about your days as you would. Don't change anything Ethan would notice. The word routine sat in my chest like something cold. How long? I asked. 1 week, he said. Possibly less. We're close. I went downstairs at 8:15 when I heard Ethan moving in the kitchen. He was making eggs scrambled the way he always made them on Saturday mornings, standing at the stove in a t-shirt and pajama pants with his back to the hallway. He looked entirely ordinary. He looked like my son on a Saturday morning. "You're up late," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Sleep okay?" "Rough night," I said, and settled into my chair. You know how it is at my age. Brain doesn't always cooperate. He smiled sympathetically. "You want coffee?" "Please," I said. He poured it and set it in front of me. And I wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the surface of the coffee and thought, I am 68 years old, and I am sitting at my own kitchen table, lying to my son about why I didn't sleep, and he is handing me coffee with both hands and smiling, and I cannot tell even now whether any part of what I see in his face is real. "Just a rough night," I said again. "I'm fine." He nodded and went back to the eggs. That afternoon I drove to Frank's. I sat across from him at the same kitchen table where we had played cards for 22 years, and I told him everything. Not all the technical details, but enough. The box, the documents, the call that morning. Frank listened the way Frank always listens, with his hands flat on the table and his eyes steady, not interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Harold, about 2 years ago, Ethan called me." I looked at him. He asked me casually, "You know how he does it, like he was just checking in, whether I had noticed you saying anything strange lately, whether your memory seemed off, whether you'd been confused about dates or mixed up details when we talked." Frank's jaw tightened. "I thought he was worried about you. I thought it was a son keeping an eye on his father." The kitchen felt very still. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him you were sharp as ever, and he had nothing to worry about," Frank said. And then I forgot about it entirely until this moment. I stared at the grain of Frank's kitchen table for a long time. Frank was the one who said quietly, "Call Donovan back, tonight. Tell him about this." I did. And Donovan, when he heard it, went silent for 3 seconds. The silence of a man whose suspicions have just been confirmed, and then told me to come, in the following morning, for a confidential medical screening at a facility the FBI used for exactly this kind of case. I drove home in the early evening, with Frank's words sitting in the cab of the truck beside me like a passenger. How long had Ethan been building this? How many people around me had he called? How many of them had quietly begun to question my mind, while I went on smiling and playing cards and believing that everything was fine? The questions I had driven home with the night before got their answers the following morning. Not the way answers usually come gradually through conversation with time to adjust. These came the way a door comes off its hinges all at once, and with a sound you don't forget. The FBI facility was not what I expected. I had pictured something stark and institutional, fluorescent lights, metal chairs, the particular atmosphere of a place where difficult things happen routinely. What Donovan directed me to was a low, unremarkable medical building on the east side of the city, the kind that shares a parking lot with a dental practice and a tax preparation office. Nothing on the exterior announced what went on inside. Donovan met me in the lobby. In person, he was exactly what his voice had suggested, a man in his mid-40s, steady and deliberate, with the kind of face that doesn't offer much but doesn't conceal badly either. He shook my hand and introduced me to the physician handling my case, Dr. Carol Whitfield, a forensic medical consultant who worked regularly with the Bureau's Pharmaceutical Investigations Unit. She was calm and thorough in the way of someone who has delivered difficult news, often enough to have learned how to do it with care. The blood draw took less than 10 minutes. The preliminary panel results came back within the hour. Dr. Whitfield set the report on the table between us and walked me through it without rushing. The compound NXG7 was present in my system. Detectable levels consistent with long-term low-dose oral administration over a period of several months to a year. She described it in precise, measured terms. an experimental neuromodulatory agent unlicensed and unapproved by the FDA or any domestic regulatory body. Developed by Nexogen Corp as part of a proprietary research program. At low doses administered consistently over time, its documented effects included progressive fatigue, intermittent loss of short-term retention, mild disorientation, and a gradual reduction in what she called executive confidence, the quiet internal certainty that allows a person to trust their own perceptions. The compound doesn't cause dramatic or sudden changes, she said. That's by design. The goal appears to be a slow cumulative effect that presents externally as the natural cognitive changes associated with aging, easy to attribute to other causes, difficult to detect without a targeted screening. I sat across from her and listened to her describe what had been happening inside my own body, and I recognized every word of it. The dizziness I had chalked up to getting up too quickly in the mornings. The days when names or dates slipped sideways and wouldn't come when I reached for them. I had joked about it with Frank, called it senior moments. Laughed it off the way men our age do when the alternative is too uncomfortable to consider. The fatigue that had settled into my afternoons like weather, the way I had started going to bed earlier. The way some evenings the effort of following a conversation felt like carrying something heavy up a long staircase. I had been aging, I told myself. This was what aging felt like. Now I understood that someone had been helping it along. Donovan, seated to my left, spoke after Dr. Whitfield finished. Tommy Briggs first came to us with information about the Nexogen contract, the financial arrangement, the delivery chain. At that point, we had evidence of an illegal trial agreement and forged consent documentation. He paused. What we did not yet have confirmed was the method of administration. The results from this morning changed that significantly. He put it in the vitamins, I said. Almost certainly. The capsule you preserved gives us a direct sample to test against your blood panel. If they match, and we expect they will, that closes the evidentiary loop. I thought about the capsule and the tissue paper in my trouser pocket. Such a small, ordinary-looking thing to be the hinge on which everything now turned. What happens next? I asked. We build the case, Donovan said, and you go home. I went home. For 3 weeks, I went home every evening and sat at the dinner table and ate what Ethan cooked and answered his questions about my day and laughed when the moment called for it and said goodnight at 10 o'clock and meant none of it. I want to be honest about what those weeks cost me, not just in the obvious way, the effort of performing normalcy while carrying what I knew, but in a deeper, more corrosive way. Every meal became something I had to get through. Every kind gesture, the coffee set in front of me without being asked, the blanket folded on the couch, arm the small, automatic courtesies of a son who knew his father's habits landed differently now. I couldn't receive them at face value. I couldn't dismiss them entirely either, because beneath the suspicion, beneath the cold clarity of what I had read in that steel box, there was still a part of me that had raised this person. That had driven him to his first day of kindergarten and waited in the parking lot. That had sat in that auditorium and cried. Those weeks I kept both things alive at once. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. There was one night, a Wednesday, the second week of April, when I stood in the hallway outside Ethan's door. At 2 a.m, my right hand raised knuckles an inch from the wood. I don't know what I would have said if he had answered. I don't know what I was asking for. Maybe just for him to explain it in a way that made sense in a language I could understand as a father. Maybe just to hear his voice say something true. My hand came back down. I walked to the kitchen and called Donovan instead. I don't know how much longer I can do this, I said. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then, "It's almost over, Mr. Mercer, I promise." I held on to those words for another full week. Then on a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of April, Ethan came home later than usual. He wasn't alone. The man with him was somewhere in his mid-40s, dressed in a dark suit that was slightly too formal for a casual visit, carrying a leather portfolio under one arm with the particular grip of someone transporting something he considers important. He had the polished, practiced manner of a person accustomed to navigating difficult conversations on behalf of other people. Ethan introduced him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I shook the man's hand and looked down at the portfolio as he set it on the hallway table, just briefly, just long enough to read the tab printed on the front of the topmost folder inside. Probate court. I looked back up at Ethan. He was still smiling. The smile was still there when I came downstairs. Ethan had set up the living room the way you set up a room, when you want something to feel casual but have thought carefully about where everyone will sit. The good armchairs pulled slightly forward. The coffee table cleared. A pot of coffee already made cups set out the kind of domestic arrangement that says this is just a conversation with such deliberate ease that it announces the opposite. The man from the hallway was already seated when I entered. Up close, he was what his suit had promised, polished, unhurried, the kind of man who has learned to make expensive stillness look like confidence. He was somewhere in his mid-40s with the particular grooming of a person who considers their appearance a professional tool. His handshake when I offered mine was practiced and calibrated, firm enough to suggest substance, not firm enough to suggest aggression. "Mr. Mercer," he said with a warmth that arrived precisely on cue. "I'm Stuart Colby. I specialize in family estate law and protective legal arrangements. Ethan speaks very highly of you. Family estate law and protective legal arrangements." I sat down across from him and folded my hands in my lap and said, "Is that right?" Colby opened his portfolio with the ease of a man who has done this particular presentation many times. The documents he produced were clean, professionally formatted, bound with the kind of care that signals money spent on the appearance of legitimacy. He walked me through them in a tone calibrated to sound like concern, gentle measured the voice of someone performing care for an audience of one. The centerpiece of his presentation was a psychological evaluation. 12 pages letterhead from a practice I didn't recognize, signed by a doctor. Philip Norris, whose credentials were listed in full below his signature. I had never heard that name. I had certainly never sat across from him in any office, never answered his questions, never submitted to any evaluation of any kind. But my name was at the top of every page, and the findings, the careful clinical language describing progressive short-term memory impairment, diminished executive function, increased susceptibility to confusion and disorientation, read like a transcript of Ethan's notebook entries, not similar, not parallel. The same observations restated in the formal register of a professional assessment. Subject demonstrates recurring difficulty retaining recent information. Subject shows measurable decline in confidence regarding personal decision-making. Subject may benefit from supportive legal oversight to ensure the protection of his interests and assets. I read that paragraph 3 times. Colby was talking, while I read something about how this kind of arrangement was increasingly common for men my age, how it wasn't a reflection of incapacity, but simply a precautionary framework, how Ethan had been concerned for some time and had only sought professional guidance out of love and responsibility. The word love came out of his mouth with the fluency of a word he had used in this context, before many times for many different clients. I looked up from the document. Ethan was seated slightly behind Colby, and to his left, his ankle crossed over his knee, his expression arranged into something that resembled paternal concern, if you didn't look too carefully. The coffee in front of him was untouched. "What exactly is it you need from me?" I asked. Colby produced the final page. It was a petition for legal guardianship, my name as the subject, Ethan's name as the proposed guardian, with a signature line at the bottom, blank waiting. "Just your authorization," Colby said pleasantly. "A formality, really, to allow Ethan to assist with financial and medical decisions going forward, for your protection." The room was very quiet. I have spent a great deal of time since then thinking about what I felt in that moment. People might expect rage or grief. What I actually felt sitting in my own living room in the house I had owned for 37 years was something colder and more precise than either of those things. It was the feeling of recognizing a mechanism of seeing suddenly and clearly, the shape of something that had been assembled around you while you were looking the other way. Every piece of it was there, the compound administered for months producing symptoms. The symptoms logged in a private notebook, translated into a formal psychiatric evaluation by a doctor I had never met. The evaluation used to justify a legal petition, that would transfer authority over my finances and my medical care, my entire remaining life, to the person who had orchestrated all of it. Each step followed from the last. Each step was on its own almost defensible. I put the petition back on the coffee table. "I appreciate you coming in person," I said. "This is a lot to take in. I'd like a few days to review everything before I sign anything." Colby's expression didn't change. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He recapped his pen and closed his portfolio and stood with the unhurried ease of a man who does not expect to be refused. "I'll leave copies with you." "Thank you," I said. Ethan walked him to the door. I heard them speak briefly in the hallway, too low to catch, and then the front door closed, and Ethan came back into the living room and asked if I wanted more coffee, and I said, "No, thank you." And he said goodnight, Dad, and went upstairs. I sat in the armchair for 10 minutes without moving. Then I called Donovan. He picked up on the second ring, and I told him what had happened, and when I finished, he said, "Good, you did exactly right. Don't sign anything." "I won't," I said. I told him about Colby, about the evaluation from the doctor I'd never seen, about the petition. Donovan listened without interrupting, and when I described the language of the psychiatric report, I heard him writing something down. "The doctor's name, Norris?" "Philip Norris," I said. The letterhead listed an address in Beaverton. "We'll pull his license records," Donovan said. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of the living room and let myself think about something I had been holding at arm's length for weeks. The times Ethan had brought papers for me to sign documents he described as lab compliance forms or insurance updates or administrative filings that he'd explained in just enough detail to make, following up, seem unnecessary. I had signed them without reading closely the way you sign things for someone you trust, absolutely the way a father signs things his son brings home from a responsible adult life. I thought about each one of those moments now and wondered what had actually been on those pages. I thought about how many strokes of a pen it takes to dismantle a man. That night, for the first time, I understood what it felt like to be erased, not taken suddenly, not forgotten. Erased the way someone quietly drags a rubber across a page, stroke by stroke, removing everything that was written there until all that's left is a clean surface that belongs to someone else, one signature at a time. 2 days after Stuart Colby left my living room, Frank called. It was a Wednesday morning early enough that I was still on my first cup of coffee sitting at the kitchen table while Ethan was in the shower upstairs. I had learned in the weeks since that Saturday phone call with Donovan to have certain conversations only when I could be certain the water was running. "I know someone," Frank said without preamble. "A lawyer, sharp as anything. She handled my nephew's estate dispute 2 years ago, the mess with the property in Tillamook. She knew things about probate law that the other side's attorney clearly didn't, and she was the calmest person in the room the entire time." A brief pause. "I think you need her, Harold." Her name was Margaret Ellis. We met that same afternoon at her office on Southwest Morrison, 3 blocks from where Mercer's Pharmacy had once stood. A coincidence I noticed and did not mention. Her office was the kind that projects competence without trying to impress: good furniture, working bookshelves, a desk that actually had things on it. She was 50 years old, trim, and direct, with reading glasses she took on and off, depending on whether she was looking at a document or at you. She looked at me for a long moment when I finished explaining the situation. "Let me make sure I understand," she said. "There is an active FBI investigation. You have forensic medical confirmation of an unlicensed compound in your system. You have documentary evidence which you located independently in your own home of a fraudulent consent signature and an illegal research contract. And 2 days ago, a man who identified himself as a family estate attorney presented you with a psychiatric evaluation signed by a doctor you have never seen, as the basis for a guardianship petition over your person and assets." "That's correct," I said. Margaret set her glasses down on the desk. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "they are not subtle." It was the first time in weeks that something had made me want to laugh. I didn't, but I felt the impulse, and it was almost a relief just to feel something that wasn't dread. She spent the next hour working through the legal architecture with me: probate court jurisdiction, the specific grounds on which the guardianship petition could be challenged. the evidentiary weight of the FBI's documentation against the Norris evaluation. She spoke with the brisk clarity of someone who has navigated this terrain before and knows which footholds hold. The fraudulent psychiatric report was her primary target without Norris's credentials, withstanding scrutiny, and Donovan had already indicated they would not. The petition's entire foundation collapsed. The FBI timeline is what matters most right now, she said. If they move before Ethan refiles or escalates, we have the stronger position. If he acts first, she left the sentence open in a way that communicated its meaning clearly. Stay close to your phone. I told her I would. That evening, Donovan came to Frank's house. He arrived at 7 a Plain sedan in the driveway, and Frank let him in and put coffee on, and then had the grace to find something to do in another part of the house. Donovan sat across from me at Frank's kitchen table, the same table where Frank and I had played cards for 22 years, and he set a thin folder between us. There's something you need to know, he said, about the delivery man. I went still. The man in the gray jacket, he said. The one who has been making the Friday deliveries for the past 5 years. He opened the folder to a single photograph, a DMV photo, slightly out of date but recognizable. His name is Tommy Briggs. He's 40 years old. He worked at Mercer's Pharmacy on Morrison Street from 2010 until 2018. The room did a quiet sideways thing. I looked at the photograph. I looked at the face older now than the version I had known, the jawline heavier, the expression more guarded. But the structure underneath was the same. I had known that face. I had spoken to that face across a dispensary counter for 8 years. Tommy, I said. The name came out of my mouth before I had decided to say it. He left the pharmacy voluntarily in 2018. Donovan continued. In late 2019, Ethan made contact with him. At that time, Ethan was aware of an incident from Tommy's past, a professional error during his time at the pharmacy, something that had never been formally reported. Donovan chose his words with care. Ethan used that knowledge as leverage. Tommy began making the Friday deliveries in January 2020. I sat with that for a moment. He was coerced, I said. Yes. For 5 years. Yes. Donovan's voice didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. In December of last year, Tommy contacted our field office independently. He had been watching the situation develop for months, watching your health, watching the deliveries, watching what he understood was happening, and he said he had reached a point where he could not continue without acting. Donovan paused. His words when he came in were, I used to work for that man. He was good to me. I'm not doing this anymore. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside, the evening had gone properly dark. Through Frank's kitchen window, I could see the neighbor's porch light, steady and yellow in the early April air. He's the one who told you the combination, I said finally. He observed Ethan entering the code on one occasion. He memorized it. When he came to us, that was part of what he brought. Donovan closed the folder. He took a significant personal risk doing what he did. I thought you should know who he is. 1 more week, Donovan said, standing to leave. We need 1 more week to finalize the case file. Then we move. I walked him to Frank's front door and watched his sedan pull out of the driveway. Frank appeared from the hallway with 2 cups of fresh coffee and sat down across from me without a word. We sat that way for a while, the way we had sat together through other things over the years when language didn't quite fit what needed to be held. I thought about a young man behind the counter on Morrison Street, careful and quiet and grateful to have a job he was good at. I thought about 8 years of shared mornings and small professional courtesies, and the ordinary trust of a workplace. I thought about what it must have cost him 5 years of showing up every Friday, carrying something he knew was wrong, watching the man he was delivering it to grow slower and more tired every month. I had not thought of Tommy Briggs in 15 years. He had been thinking of me. The man I had not thought about in all that time had been standing quietly between me and the dark for as long as he could until he found a way to open the door, while my own son had been working steadily on the lock from the other side. Just a quick note before we continue, some parts of this story are enhanced with fictional elements and may not fully reflect real life. If you're enjoying the story, feel free to share it and subscribe to stay updated on future videos. But if this isn't for you, you're completely free to stop here. It happened on a Friday. Of course it did. Everything in this story happened on a Friday. I had made it through the week the way Donovan had asked me to, carefully, quietly, one ordinary day at a time. I played cards with Frank on Thursday instead of Friday. That week, a small scheduling shift. I told Ethan was Frank's idea, and Ethan had nodded and said sure. Whatever works with the ease of a man who has no reason to object to anything. I had called Margaret twice. I had spoken to Donovan once briefly on Wednesday evening when Ethan was at the gym. The case file was nearly complete, he said. They were waiting on one final piece of documentation from Nexogen's financial records. One more week had become, a few more days had become almost there. And then it was Friday, and Ethan made pot roast. The smell reached me at the top of the stairs, the same low, slow warmth of braised beef and rosemary that had been the smell of Friday evenings in this house for years. I stood at the top of the staircase for a moment before coming down one hand on the banister, and I thought about the last time I had sat across from that smell and that table and that man, and how different everything had looked from the inside than compared to now. Task 5 had been about keeping still, about holding the surface of things intact while the interior came apart. This Friday was going to be different, though I didn't know it yet. I came downstairs at 6:30. The table was set the same way it always was, placemats, ceramic bowls, the bread basket. Ethan carried the pot from the stove to the table with the unhurried ease of someone doing something for the 100th time, and we sat down, and we ate, and we talked about nothing that mattered. He asked about my week. I told him it had been quiet. He mentioned a presentation he had given at work, something about trial phase outcomes delivered with the fluency of a man entirely at ease in his professional life. I listened and nodded and passed the bread when he reached for it. The amber bottle appeared midway through the meal the way it always did. I took the capsules the way I always did, or appeared to. One went into my mouth. One I held back. The same routine I had maintained for weeks. The small, quiet act of preservation that Donovan had told me was essential to the evidentiary record. We finished eating. Ethan cleared the plates. I sat back in my chair and held my water glass and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, where the last light of the April evening was going soft and gray over the fence line. 20 minutes after the meal, it began. It started the way it always started, a faint displacement behind the eyes, a slight loosening of the world's edges. I had felt this before in milder forms on other Friday evenings, and each time I had attributed it to fatigue or age or the particular tiredness of a week spent managing things I couldn't speak aloud. But this was not that. This was a different order of thing entirely. The dizziness came in a wave, not the gentle kind that passes when you sit still, but the kind that removes the floor from under you, even when you haven't moved. The kitchen tilted. The overhead light fractured at its edges. I set my water glass down and missed the table slightly, and the glass caught the rim and tipped, and I heard it hit the floor and shatter from what felt like a very long distance. Dadol. Ethan's voice came from across the table, concerned, immediate. My hands were shaking. Not the mild tremor of an old man's cold fingers, a deep involuntary shudder that started somewhere in my forearms and moved outward beyond my ability to suppress it. I gripped the edge of the table. The wood felt distant under my hands, like touching something through a thick glove. I tried to stand. My legs had their own opinion about that. The chair caught me briefly on the way down, and then the kitchen floor came up fast, and I was on my hands and knees on the tile, and then I wasn't even that I was on my side. And the broken glass was somewhere nearby, and the ceiling was a long way up, and the light was wrong. Dad. Ethan was beside me. I could feel him close, could hear him reaching for his phone, could hear his voice shift into the clear, controlled register of someone calling for emergency services, calm, precise, giving the address and the symptoms with the fluency of a man who has thought about this moment. He has thought about this moment, I understood from the floor. I looked up at him. At the lines of his face above mine, the furrowed brow, the tight jaw, the wide eyes that held exactly the right amount of alarm. He was saying my name. He was holding my shoulder. He was performing the role of a terrified son with a completeness that might have convinced anyone who hadn't spent the past 3 weeks reading his private notebook. The ceiling continued to dim at its edges. I thought with the particular clarity that sometimes arrives in the narrowing seconds before the world goes fully quiet, He is very good at this. I thought I raised him. Somewhere in the raising, I taught him how to look like he meant it. I thought I wonder if he ever did. I learned later through Donovan in a hospital room 4 days after that Friday what happened in the minutes after the emergency team arrived. While the paramedics were working in the kitchen, Ethan had stepped into the hallway. His phone screen recovered as part of the FBI's evidence collection showed a message sent at 8:47 p.m. to a number registered to Stuart Colby. The message read, "The old man went down. Move forward with the estate filing." 7 words. The efficiency of someone who had been waiting to send them. I have read that message many times since then in the way you return to something that contains more weight than its length suggests. 7 words. My entire remaining life compressed into 7 words, sent while I was lying on my kitchen floor, surrounded by broken glass and paramedics, and the smell of pot roast going cold on the table above me. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was my son's face above mine, worried, convincing, perfect. And I remember thinking even then, even at the bottom of it, he was always the better actor. I just never knew what he was rehearsing for. The first thing I was aware of was sound. A steady mechanical rhythm, patient and indifferent, the kind of sound that exists only to report that something is still working. Then light the particular flat white of a room built for function rather than comfort. Then smell antiseptic and recycled air, and the faint sweetness of plastic tubing. Then slowly the weight of my own body in a bed that was not mine. I turned my head. Ray Donovan was sitting in the chair beside my bed, his jacket folded over the armrest, a paper cup of coffee balanced on his knee. He was not asleep. He looked like a man who had decided some hours ago that he was not going to sleep and had made his peace with the decision. "Mr. Mercer," he said. "How long?" I said. My voice came out rough and unfamiliar. 4 days. I looked at the ceiling for a moment. 4 days. The last thing I remembered clearly was the kitchen floor and the light going wrong, and my son's face above mine arranged into something that looked like fear. "Ethan," I said. Donovan set his coffee down. "Taken into federal custody the night you were admitted. The arrest warrant had been ready for 48 hours. We were waiting on the financial documentation from Nexogen. When the emergency call came in, we moved." He paused. "Nexogen Corp is under full federal investigation. 3 executives have been detained. The research program has been formally suspended." I processed that in silence. "Colby?" I asked. "His law license is under review. The guardianship petition was dismissed by the court 2 days ago. Margaret Ellis filed the challenge the morning after your admission. The Norris evaluation has been flagged as fraudulent. Dr. Norris is cooperating with investigators." I looked at the window. Gray Portland sky, the kind that could be morning or afternoon, or anywhere between. "If Frank was here," Donovan said. "He sat with you through the first night. He asked me to tell you that he'll be back this evening and that he's bringing the good coffee from the place on Burnside." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I asked the question I had been holding since I'd opened my eyes. "Did Ethan ask about me after they took him in? Did he ask how I was?" Donovan looked at me steadily. The pause before his answer was exactly 1 second too long. Then he shook his head once very slightly. I turned back to the window and watched the gray sky and didn't say anything else for a long time. 2 weeks after I was discharged, Margaret called. She needed documentation from the original Mercer's Pharmacy business records, financial statements from the period between 2019 and 2021, which were relevant to establishing the timeline of Ethan's arrangement with Nexogen. The records had been archived when I sold the business stored in the back office of the Morrison Street location, which the new ownership had agreed to make accessible for legal purposes. Margaret offered to send a paralegal. I told her I would go myself. The drive down Morrison Street took 12 minutes. I had made that drive 10,000 times over 40 years, in every season, in every state of mind a life produces. I knew every traffic light, every side street, every parking configuration. I could have driven it without thinking. That morning, I thought about every inch of it. The building looked the same from the outside. Same brick facade, same corner entrance, same wide display window. But the signage was different. Clean sans serif lettering in a shade of blue that had nothing to do with me. spelling out the name of the regional chain that had absorbed Mercer's along with 40 other independent pharmacies across the Pacific Northwest. The green and white of Mercer's was gone as completely as if it had never been there. I sat in the car for a moment before going in. The new manager, a polite young man who introduced himself as Derek, led me to the back office and gave me access to the archive room without complication. I spent 20 minutes locating the financial records Margaret needed, setting them aside in a box by the door. It was on my way out that I stopped. The safe was still there. It was built into the wall behind the old supply cabinet, a floor-safe, heavy steel combination lock. The same one I had installed in 1994 when the store's controlled substance inventory had grown large enough to require it. The new management had apparently not found a reason to remove it. It sat there behind the cabinet exactly as I had left it almost 5 years ago, when I had locked it on my last day and walked away without looking back. I had not thought about what was inside it, or perhaps I had not allowed myself to. I knelt down in front of it and put in the combination, 6 digits I had not consciously recalled in years, and which my hands remembered without hesitation, and the door swung open. The business documents were there. Licensing files, insurance records, supplier contracts, the expected archaeology of a working life. I moved through them, methodically setting aside what Margaret might need. And then near the back, behind a manila folder of equipment warranties, my hand found something that stopped it. A letter-sized envelope, yellow, the particular soft yellow of paper that has sat undisturbed for years. My name on the front in handwriting I would have recognized in the dark in a crowd at the end of any distance. Harold. Open this when you need to remember who I was. Eleanor's handwriting, Eleanor's instruction, Eleanor's voice reaching across 8 years. I sat down on the floor of the archive room with the envelope in my hands and I opened it. The letter was 2 pages dated November 2014, 3 years before she passed. Written when she would have known the diagnosis was coming, even if the formal confirmation had not yet arrived. Her handwriting was steady. Eleanor's handwriting was always steady. She wrote about the pharmacy, about the years we had built together and what they had meant to her, and the particular satisfaction of a life spent doing something that helped people in small daily ways. She wrote about us, about the late start and the good marriage and the improbable rightness of 2 people who had found each other after they had already given up on being found. And then she wrote about Ethan. Our son is brilliant. You know this better than anyone. You saw it before I did. But I have watched him for 30 years, and I have seen something that your love for him makes harder to see. Brilliance without conscience is not a gift, Harold. It is a weight, and it falls on the people standing closest. I have watched him look at what you built and see not what it means, but what it is worth. I have watched him learn to say the right things without feeling them. I have watched him practice being a son, the way some people practice a presentation, effectively, correctly, and from a distance. I am not writing this to ask you to love him less. I know that is not possible, and I would not want it to be. I am writing this because when I am gone, there will be no one who watches him the way I watch him. You will be alone with your trust in him, and your trust in him is the most generous and the most dangerous thing about you. Take care of yourself, Harold. Not just the business, not just the house. Yourself. Please. I love you. I have always loved you. Remember that if nothing else. Eleanor. I sat on the floor of that archive room for a long time, with the 2 pages in my hands. I did not make any sound. I simply sat in the particular silence of a man reading something he was not ready to read for 8 years and finds at the end. That he was never going to be ready, that readiness was never the point. The point was the letter. The point was that she wrote it. She had tried to tell me in the only way she knew how, in a letter, in a locked safe, waiting for the day I would finally be willing to listen. The paperwork for a federal pharmaceutical trial, it turns out, fills a great many folders. Margaret's conference table had disappeared under them over the preceding weeks. Binders of medical documentation, financial records subpoenaed from Nexigen Corp. Forensic analyses of the consent forgeries. Tommy's formal deposition, the capsule lab, results cross-referenced against my blood panel. Every piece of it was labeled, indexed, and arranged with the particular precision of a woman who treats legal preparation, the way a surgeon treats an operating theater, nothing out of place. Nothing left to chance. I had been coming to Margaret's office on Southwest Morrison 2 or 3 times a week since my discharge. I had learned the rhythm of her working style, the brisk efficiency that softened occasionally into something that felt almost like warmth. The way she would pause in the middle of a procedural explanation to ask quietly whether I was managing. She never lingered on the question. She just asked it, heard the answer, and moved on, which was exactly the right way to ask it. That afternoon in late May, we had been working through the trial timeline for 2 hours when Donovan closed the folder in front of him and set both hands flat on the table. "There's something personal I need to say to you, Mr. Mercer," he said. Before we go any further, Margaret looked up from her notes. I looked at Donovan. He was not a man who used the word personal lightly. In the months I had known him, he had been consistently professional, warm enough to be human, contained enough to be trusted. This was different. He had the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for the right moment to say something and has decided the moment has arrived. "My father's name was Gerald Donovan," he said. "He lived on Halsey Street in Northeast Portland for most of his adult life. He passed away in the spring of 2022 at 70 years old." I listened. He was a diabetic for the last 25 years of his life. Managed it carefully for the most part. He was a disciplined man, my father. But he was also a man who lived on a fixed income, and there were months toward the end of the month when the numbers didn't work. Donovan's voice was steady, but there was something beneath the steadiness that he was managing with some effort. Insulin is not a luxury. You can't defer it the way you defer a phone bill. The room was very quiet. He told me once, this was maybe 8 or 9 years ago. We were having dinner at his place, and he was talking about his week. He told me about a pharmacist on Morrison Street. He said that whenever he came up short, this man would hand him what he needed and wave him off. No forms, no interest, no conditions. Donovan paused. He said he'd tried to pay it back several times over the years, and this man never kept track. My father asked him once why he did it. He said the pharmacist told him, "You need it today. Pay me when you can. If you can't, I'll consider it an investment in the neighborhood." I remembered that. I remembered saying something like that. I had said variations of it dozens of times over 40 years to dozens of people, and I had meant it each time, and then forgotten it the way you forget the ordinary good you do when you are busy doing the next thing. I had not known Gerald Donovan's name, but I knew the man Donovan was describing, the particular dignity of someone who manages a difficult condition without complaint, who shows up every month and says thank you with a sincerity that costs them something. He said you were the kindest man he had ever done business with, Donovan said. He said that a number of times over the years. It was the kind of thing my father repeated when something had genuinely meant something to him. Donovan looked down at the folder for a moment. "When the Nexogen case came across my desk 14 months ago, the subject file had your name on it. Harold Mercer, retired pharmacist, Portland Heights." He looked back up. "I pulled your business history in about 20 minutes. Morrison Street, 3 locations, 40 years. I knew who you were before I read the second page of the case file." A pause. "I went to my supervisor that afternoon and asked to be assigned lead on the investigation. She asked if I had a conflict of interest. I told her I had the opposite. I had a personal reason to make sure the case was handled correctly." He said this last part without drama, the way honest men state true things. The conference room held the information for a moment. I looked at Ray Donovan, this careful, deliberate man, who had handed me a brown envelope in the rain and whispered instructions and then walked away, and I saw for the first time, past the professional stillness to the thing underneath it. He had his father's eyes, I thought. Not the color necessarily, but the quality, the eyes of someone who keeps accounts in the way that actually matters. Margaret, who had been listening without expression, set down her pen. "The trial is scheduled for the 2nd week of August," she said, returning us to the present with the quiet authority of someone who knows when a moment needs to be allowed to pass. "Naive Federal Docket, Portland Division. Given the volume of evidence compiled over the 14-month investigation, the forensic documentation, the financial records, the medical findings, and the witness testimonies, the prosecution anticipates a relatively concentrated proceeding." She looked at me. "Harold, I want you prepared for what it means to sit in that room, to hear the charges read, to watch the process work." "I'll be there," I said. "I know," she said. I looked at Donovan again. There are things that happen in a life, small, unremarkable things. The ordinary gestures of a person trying to run a business with some decency that scatter forward into the future with no way of knowing where they'll land. A wave of the hand. A supply of insulin passed across a counter at the end of a difficult month. A brief exchange in a pharmacy on a street that no longer bears the same name. I had not thought about Gerald Donovan in years. I had not thought about any of the hundreds of small accommodations I had made over 4 decades, because they had not seemed like things worth holding on to. They were just the texture of running a business the way I believed a business should be run. I had no way of knowing that one of them had come back 20 years later in the form of a man with his father's eyes and quietly decided that the account was not yet settled. It had seemed at the time like such a small thing. A man who needed his medication and didn't have the money that particular week. A pharmacist who decided that was reason enough. I had no idea that one day that small thing would be the reason someone chose to come back for me. The federal courthouse on Southwest 3rd Avenue is a building that does not apologize for what it is. Granite steps, heavy glass doors, the particular hush of a public space that has absorbed over many decades the full weight of what human beings are capable of doing to one another and to themselves. I had driven past it hundreds of times over 40 years, without once considering that I would ever have reason to walk through its doors. I was a pharmacist. I filled prescriptions and balanced ledgers, and came home on Fridays and played cards with my friend. These were not the circumstances that led a man to a federal courthouse. And yet, I arrived at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning in the second week of August, wearing the gray suit I had last worn to Eleanor's memorial service. Because it was the most serious thing I owned, and the day seemed to require it, Margaret met me on the steps. She was composed in the way she always was, precisely dressed unhurried, carrying her briefcase with the ease of someone entirely at home in this building. She put her hand briefly on my arm before we went inside, and she didn't say anything, and that was exactly right. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined. Functional institutional, the wood paneling of an earlier era, worn smooth by decades of proceedings. The gallery benches were the kind that offer no encouragement to comfort. I took my seat in the front row and folded my hands on my knees and looked straight ahead. Ethan was already at the defense table when I came in. He was wearing a dark suit I didn't recognize. His hair was shorter than it had been in April. He sat with the controlled posture of a man who has been coached on how to appear in a room like this. And from the moment I sat down to the moment the proceedings concluded, he did not turn around. Not once. Not even when his name was read aloud. Not when the charges were enumerated. Not when the recording was played. He did not look at me. I had not known until that moment how much I had been bracing for the possibility that he would. The federal prosecutor moved efficiently as Donovan had said she would. The evidence compiled over 14 months of investigation had been organized into a case that left little room for ambiguity, and the defense found itself repeatedly with limited ground to stand on. The first witness called was a forensic document analyst who walked the court through the consent forgeries with the methodical clarity of an expert who has testified many times and understands that precision is more persuasive than drama. The signature discrepancies were projected on a screen, the real and the forged side by side, and explained in terms that required no specialist knowledge to follow. The courtroom was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the thing being presented is undeniable. Then the financial records, the Nexogen contract, its $2 million valuation, the milestone payment structure tied to each phase of the trial's progression. An executive from Nexagen's finance division, one of 3 who had agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for reduced exposure, confirmed the contractual arrangement in a voice that suggested he had spent a great deal of time recently reconsidering his professional decisions. And then Tommy Briggs was called to the stand. He walked to the witness stand with the particular gait of a man carrying more than his own weight, not slow, not hesitant, but deliberate in the way of someone who has made a decision and is holding to it through the difficulty of the moment. He was dressed in a plain gray suit that I suspected was new. His hands, when he settled into the chair and faced the court, were not entirely still. He stated his name, his former occupation, his years at Mercer's Pharmacy on Morrison Street. And then, over the course of 40 minutes, in a voice that began rough and steadied as he went, he told the court everything. The call from Ethan in 2019. The nature of the leverage used against him, a dispensing error from his time at the pharmacy, the kind of mistake that ends careers, which Ethan had documented and held in reserve. The first delivery in January 2020. The 243 Fridays that followed. The gradual understanding of what he was delivering. The evening in the summer of 2023 when he had stood at the end of Harold Mercer's front walk and tried to find the words and failed. The December morning in 2024 when he had walked into the FBI field office on Southwest Broadway and said, "I'm done. I need to tell you something." The courtroom was very still while Tommy spoke. When he finished and stepped down from the stand, he turned toward the gallery. His eyes found mine, not searching, not apologetic, just direct. The look of a man who has done the thing he came to do and wants to know without asking whether it was enough. I nodded once. He nodded back and walked to his seat. The audio recording was played after the lunch recess. Donovan had prepared me for this, and I was grateful for the preparation because nothing else could have been. The recording was clear, a phone conversation between Ethan and a senior research director at Nexigen, captured during the FBI's surveillance period. They discussed the trial's progression in the dispassionate language of men, reviewing a business metric, Subject 07's compliance rate. Phase 2, parameters met ahead of schedule. Recommend Phase 3 advancement to consolidate results before the guardianship filing. I sat in the gallery and listened to my son discuss my cognitive deterioration as a line item. The courtroom heard it the way a room hears something that lands at a register below ordinary sound, not loud, but with a weight that settles into the walls. I kept my hands folded. I kept my face still. I had practiced this without knowing I was practicing it for months. The deliberation was not long. The jury returned on the afternoon of the second day. I was in my seat when the foreperson stood, and I watched the back of Ethan's head as the verdict was read guilty on all counts federal charges across the full scope of the indictment. Nexigen Corp's operating licenses were formally suspended pending the criminal proceedings against its leadership. And then the sentencing. The judge was a woman in her 60s, deliberate and spare in her language, the kind of voice that carries precisely as far as it needs to and no further. She spoke about the particular gravity of using professional expertise to cause harm to a vulnerable person in one's care. She spoke about the deliberate, sustained nature of the conduct. She spoke about the forged documentation and the coercive pressure applied to an unwilling participant. 12 years, federal sentencing guidelines, no recommendation for early consideration. The gavel came down. I had imagined in the abstract what it would feel like to hear those words. I had expected relief, the clean, uncomplicated variety that comes when something terrible is finished, and the people responsible have been held to account. I had been carrying this since March, since a rainy Friday, in a brown envelope and a flashlight in a dark room, and I thought that a verdict would set some of it down. What I felt instead when the gavel sounded and the room began to move around me was something I did not have a name for yet. Not relief, not grief. Not anger that had burned through months ago, in the slow weeks of pretending in the hospital bed on the floor of an archive room. Something older than all of those. Something that sat in the chest quietly the way things sit, that have been there a long time and are not yet ready to leave. 12 years. The judge's voice had been flat and final. I had thought I would feel lighter when I heard it. What I felt instead was something I still hadn't found the right word for. Frank suggested dinner. Margaret offered to drive. I told them both, no thank you, and I meant it as kindly as I could, and I walked to my car alone in the August afternoon, while the courthouse steps filled with the quiet, dispersing business of a concluded proceeding. I heard Frank call after me. "Harold, you shouldn't be by yourself tonight," and I raised a hand in acknowledgement without turning around, which was not the same as agreeing with him. I drove home on surface streets instead of the highway. I don't know exactly why. Perhaps because the highway moves too fast and I needed the traffic lights. I needed the ordinary cadence of stopping and starting the familiar intersections of a city I had lived in for 40 years. the small, mundane continuity of a Tuesday afternoon in Portland going about its business regardless of what had just happened on Southwest 3rd Avenue. I pulled into the driveway at Birchwood Lane at 4:30. The house looked the same as it always had. Of course it did. Houses don't register what happens inside them. I sat in the car for a moment before going in. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of an empty house I had lived alone, more or less for the better part of 5 years. And I knew what that sounded like. This was different. This was the quiet of a space that had recently held someone, and now didn't the kind that has a shape to it, a specific negative volume where a presence used to be. I set my keys on the hall table. I hung up my jacket. I walked to the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at the room. The table was, as I had left it that morning, 2 chairs, 2 placemats that I had never thought to remove a habit of setting for 2 that I had maintained without examining it. I stood there and looked at the chair across from mine. The one where Ethan had sat for 4 years every evening. I was home, eating meals he had cooked and telling me about his work and handing me that amber bottle with the ease of a man doing something kind. I pulled out my own chair and sat down. I didn't make coffee. I didn't turn on the news. I just sat at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light and looked at the empty chair and let myself be in the room with what had happened. The thing I had not been able to name since the gavel came down, I began sitting there to understand its shape, if not yet its name. It was not grief in the ordinary sense. Grief requires that you have lost something that was there. What I was sitting with was more complicated than that. It was the particular weight of not knowing retroactively what had been real. After a long time, I got up and walked down the hall. I stopped outside Ethan's bedroom door. The last time I had pushed this door open at night, I had been carrying a small flashlight and the instruction pages from a brown envelope moving as quietly as I knew how to move. I had been afraid of what I would find. I had found it, and it had been worse than I feared, and the room had been transformed in my memory into a place where something had been confirmed. Standing there now in ordinary lamplight in a house that belonged entirely to me, again the door looked different. Smaller. Just a door. I pushed it open. The room was neat in the way Ethan always kept it organized without being sterile. The desk cleared, the bookshelves arranged with the particular care of someone who thinks about how things appear. His academic certificates were still on the wall. His doctoral degree from OHSU, framed in dark wood, hung above the desk, exactly where he had hung it the week he moved in. I had helped him level it. We had argued mildly about the height, and he had deferred to me, and I had thought that was a small good moment between a father and a son. And I sat down on the edge of the bed. The room had the sealed quality of a space that is no longer being lived in a stillness that is different from the stillness of sleep. I sat with my hands on my knees and looked at the desk, at the certificates at the window with its drawn curtain. And I tried to do what I had been avoiding since March, simply be in this room, without an agenda, without a task, without needing to find something, or understand something, or perform something. It was harder than anything else I had done in this whole long year. I reached out and opened the drawer of the nightstand, not looking for anything, just the habitual gesture of a man sitting somewhere unfamiliar, and my hand found a photograph. It was a 4x6 print slightly bent at one corner, the kind that comes out of a drugstore envelope. Ethan and I standing in front of the OHSU commencement hall in June of 2019. He was in his doctoral regalia, the hood, the stole, the ridiculous flat-topped cap that he was wearing, slightly askew because he had always resisted being completely formal. I had my arm around his shoulders, and I was looking at the camera with the particular expression of a man who cannot stop smiling. Ethan was not looking at the camera. He was looking at me, and the expression on his face I had not seen this photograph in years, had forgotten it existed. And now I sat on the edge of his bed in the August evening and looked at it with the same attention I had given to the forged consent forms and the notebook entries and the audio recording, and I tried to read it honestly. He was smiling, not the practiced smile I had cataloged over the past months, the calibrated expression of a man managing an impression. Something else, something that sat differently around his eyes. I looked at that photograph for a long time. And then, for the first time since March, since the brown envelope and the rainy Friday and all the months of careful, deliberate holding together, I put my face in my hands and I let go. Not loudly, not dramatically, the quiet, thorough kind of release that has been building for so long that when it finally comes, it doesn't announce itself, just arrives, just moves through you like weather. And when it's done, you are still sitting in the same place, holding the same photograph, and the room is exactly as it was. I wasn't crying for what I had lost. I knew what I had lost. I was crying because I didn't know, couldn't know, sitting there with that photograph in my hands, what had been there to lose in the first place. The smile in that picture looked real. It had always looked real every time I had seen it over 34 years. Every laugh across a dinner table. Every cup of coffee set down without being asked. Every goodnight dad at the end of an ordinary evening. Was any of it real? Had he ever actually loved me? Or had I been Subject 07 from the very beginning, long before he signed any contract? Long before the first black box arrived on a January Friday, just a resource he was waiting to be old enough to use. Donovan called on a Wednesday morning in late August, 3 weeks after the verdict. He said Tommy Briggs had reached out to him, that Tommy had asked through Donovan whether Harold Mercer would be willing to meet, that he understood entirely if the answer was no, and that there was no obligation of any kind, and that he had asked Donovan to make that very clear. I told Donovan to tell Tommy yes. We met at a small coffee shop on Northeast Alberta Street, the kind of place that has been in the same location for 20 years and looks it, with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and the permanent smell of roasted beans worked into the walls. I arrived first and took a table by the window. I ordered a black coffee and watched the street and waited. Tommy came in at 10 past the hour. He was in civilian clothes jeans and a dark green jacket, no cap. And without the gray uniform of his delivery role, he looked somehow both younger and older at the same time. That younger, because the formality was gone. Older, because of what was in his face, which was the expression of a man who has been living with something heavy for a long time and knows walking through a door that he is about to set it down. He saw me. He crossed the room. He sat down across from me and folded his hands on the table and looked at me directly, which I appreciated. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "thank you for coming." "Tommy," I said. He was quiet for a moment, organizing something. Then he began. He talked for nearly an hour, and I let him. Because it was clear that what he needed, what he had needed for a long time, was for someone who had been in the center of it to sit across from him and hear it without flinching. He described the call from Ethan in 2019 in a way that filled in the details I had only understood in outline, the precision of the threat. The documentation Ethan had assembled about the dispensing error thorough, damaging the kind of thing that wouldn't just cost Tommy his license, but his reputation, his livelihood, his ability to work in any field that required professional trust. He said Ethan had presented it with the particular calm of someone who had thought it through carefully and was not angry, just clear. "You'll do this," Ethan had said, or "I'll make a call." Tommy had done it. For 5 years he had done it. He talked about the Fridays, the weight of the box literally and otherwise, the particular discipline required to knock on a door, hand something to a man, avoid his eyes, and walk back to the van and drive away and not think too carefully about what you were participating in. He said he had told himself for the first 2 years that he didn't know exactly what was in the boxes, that it was research material, that it was probably fine. That I knew, he said. By year 3 I knew. I just didn't know what to do with knowing. He described the summer afternoon in 2023, the heat, the idling van. The moment at the end of the front walk when he had turned and tried to say something and found the words had stopped somewhere between his chest and his mouth. "You were standing there," he said. "You looked, I don't know. You looked like you were enjoying the evening, like everything was fine. And I thought, if I say something right now, everything changes for him. And I didn't know if I had the right to do that." He looked down at his coffee. That was the wrong way to think about it. I know that now. He talked about the months after that, the increasing clarity of what was happening, the way Harold's energy and sharpness had visibly changed over the years, in ways that Tommy recognized as more than aging, because he had watched it correlate precisely with each delivery. The December morning, when he had finally walked into the FBI field office and sat down across from a duty agent and said, "I need to report something," and I need you to understand that I am part of what I'm reporting." He finished speaking and sat back and looked at me with the openness of a man who has said everything he came to say and is prepared for whatever comes next. The coffee shop was quiet around us, a couple at the counter, the sound of the espresso machine, Alberta Street going about its morning outside the window. I looked at Tommy Briggs, this man I had employed for 8 years without knowing him well, who had been frightened into something he couldn't find his way out of, who had stood at the end of my front walk on a hot July afternoon and tried to be braver than he managed, and who had walked into a federal office on a December morning and changed the course of what happened to me. "Tommy," I said, "I didn't come here to place blame." He looked up. "I came to thank you." I said it plainly, the way plain things deserve to be said. "You saved my life, not all at once and not without difficulty and not without cost to yourself. But you did it, and I want you to know that I know that." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then his composure, which he had maintained with some effort through the entire preceding hour, came apart quietly. Not dramatically, just the way a face changes when it releases something it has been holding for too long. We sat in that coffee shop on Alberta Street for another 40 minutes without talking much. Two men who had both been used by the same person, sitting in the ordinary morning light, drinking coffee that was getting cold, finding something in the shared silence that neither of us had a precise word for, but that felt unmistakably like the first dry ground after a very long crossing. That evening, I sat in the armchair in my living room with Eleanor's letter. It was the 7th time I had read it since May, and by now the paper had taken on the softness of something handled, often the fold lines gone gentle with use. I read it slowly, the way you read something, when you're no longer looking for information, but for something harder to name. What I found that evening was different from what I had found the previous 6 times. The first time I had read it sitting on the floor of the archive room, I had felt the weight of her warning, the specific painful accuracy of a woman who had seen clearly what I had refused to see. The second and third times, grief. The fourth time, a complicated gratitude mixed with guilt for not having listened when I might have. The 5th and 6th times, the slow, difficult work of accepting what she had written as true, without using it as a lens to view every memory through. The 7th time, I finally understood what the letter actually was. It was not an accusation. It was not a verdict. It was a woman who had known her husband for 30 years, who had understood exactly what his most vulnerable quality was, his capacity for absolute trust in the people he loved, and who had, from whatever quiet place she had found to face what was coming, tried to give him something to hold on to after she was gone. She had not written it to condemn Ethan. She had written it to prepare me, to hand me across the years a piece of the clarity I would one day need, so that when the moment came, I would not be entirely without a light. And tucked inside that preparation, like something written between the lines, was the harder instruction. Not just protect yourself, but keep going. Keep being the person you are. Keep loving even when loving costs you more than you thought a person could afford to pay. I folded the letter along its well-worn lines and placed it in the breast pocket of my shirt against my chest, where I could feel its slight weight with every breath. She had not written it to condemn our son. She had written it to prepare me, to give me the strength to do what was right and then to do the thing that was harder still, to keep loving him. I didn't plan to drive to Morrison Street that afternoon. It was a Friday in late November, one of those gray, still Portland days that feel less like weather and more like the city thinking. And I had told myself I was only going out to pick up a prescription from the new pharmacy on Burnside, and maybe stop by Frank's if he was home. I ended up on Morrison Street the way you end up at a place you have been circling for months without admitting it, without deciding to, and then all at once there. I pulled into a parking space across the street and cut the engine. The building was the same. It was always going to be the same brick and glass corner entrance. The wide display window that Eleanor had insisted on when we first signed the lease, because she said people needed to be able to see inside a place before they trusted it. The blue and white signage of the regional chain that had absorbed Mercer's was bright against the gray afternoon, clean, professional, bearing no trace of the name that had been there for 30 years. I sat with the engine off and looked at it. After a while, I opened the center console, and took out two things I had been carrying in the car for the past several weeks, without quite being ready to do anything with them. The first was a photograph, small, slightly worn at the edges, the kind of image that has been handled enough times to have absorbed something of the hands that held it. A little boy in an oversized white coat, standing behind a prescription counter with his hands folded, looking out at a world he had already decided he understood. He was 7 years old in that picture. He was smiling the way children smile when they are genuinely uncomplicated happy before the world has given them reasons to practice other kinds of smiling. I had looked at that photograph hundreds of times over 30 years and seen one thing. That afternoon, parked across from the place where it was taken, I looked at it and held two things at once: what it had been and what had come after. The child who stood in that oversized coat had been real. Whatever came later, however the years had shaped and changed and ultimately bent what was in him that morning, had been real. That particular unguarded joy had been real. I still believed that. I needed to still believe that. The second thing I took out was Eleanor's letter, folded along lines that had gone soft with the weeks of being opened and refolded, carried and set down and carried again. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew every word of it by now, the way you know the words of something that has become part of how you think. I just held it in my other hand alongside the photograph and let the two of them rest there together on my lap. The boy in the white coat, the woman who had seen what I couldn't, the years between that photograph and this parking space with everything they contained. I sat there for a long time, long enough for the light to shift from the flat gray of mid-afternoon to the early dark that comes in November before you expect it. The street lamps on Morrison coming on, one by one in the dusk. A few people passed on the sidewalk, a couple with a stroller, an older man walking a dog that was taking its time about everything. The ordinary, unhurried business of a neighborhood, going about a Friday evening. I thought about Frank, who had called that morning to ask if I wanted to come for cards. I had told him maybe next week, and he had said, "Sure, whenever you're ready," which was what Frank always said when he meant something more. He had been saying variations of that for 30 years, and I had always eventually shown up, and I expected I would again. I thought about Ray Donovan, who had sent a brief message the previous month to let me know the Nexogen proceedings were progressing, that the 3 detained executives had entered pleas, that the case was moving toward its conclusion. He had added at the end, "My father would have been glad to know how this ended. I thought you should know that." I had read that message 4 times, and then saved it in a folder I did not have a name for yet. I thought about Tommy, who was working at a distribution company on the east side now, according to the last thing Donovan had mentioned, as building something new, taking it 1 week at a time. I understood that, and I thought about a man sitting in a federal correctional facility somewhere in the Portland metropolitan area, serving the first months of a 12-year sentence. And I thought about him the way I had been thinking about him for 3 months, not with the clarity of resolution, not with the peace of a thing fully processed, but with the complicated, patient ache of a father who does not know yet what he will do with what remains between them. I picked up my phone. The call connected after 2 rings to an automated system, which transferred to an operator who explained the visitation procedures in a voice of practiced neutrality. I asked the questions I needed to ask. I wrote down what she told me on the back of a gas station receipt. I found in the console visiting hours registrations requirements, the process for being added to an approved contact list. I thanked her and ended the call. I looked at what I had written, looked at it for a while. Then I folded the receipt and placed it in the breast pocket of my jacket against my chest, in the same place I had been carrying Eleanor's letter since September. The 2 pieces of paper sat there together, the warning she had written to prepare me, and the information I was not yet sure I was ready to use. I started the engine. I did not know, pulling out of that parking space and onto Morrison Street, whether I would make that drive to the correctional facility in a week or a month or a year. I did not know what I would say when I sat across from my son in a room built for exactly that kind of difficult conversation. I did not know whether he would look at me, whether he would speak first, whether there would be anything in his face that I recognized. I only knew that I had written down the information instead of closing the call without it, and that the paper was in my pocket instead of the trash. That was enough for today. There are things a year will teach you that no other span of time can. I know what it is to sit at a table with someone who is quietly working against you and find the face of love looking back. I know what it is to have the structure of trust collapse from the inside, to discover that the ordinary warmth of a shared life can be simultaneously both real and performed, that two things can be true of the same moment and neither cancels the other out. I know what it is to be saved by someone who owed you nothing, and what it is to owe your life to a December morning when a frightened man decided that enough was enough. I know that a woman who loved me left a letter in a locked safe because she understood that the day would come when I would need it, and that her understanding of me was more complete than I had known, and that grief and gratitude can occupy the same space without either one diminishing. And I know that there is a boy in a white coat in a photograph who was genuinely happy on an ordinary morning in a pharmacy on Morrison Street, standing behind a counter that no longer bears his family's name. I am not ready. I may not be ready for a long time yet, but I have learned something this year that I did not know before, that love and pain can live in the same place side by side without one erasing the other. That forgiveness is not a door you walk through once. It is a road and you travel it at whatever pace you can manage, and some days you cover more ground than others, and the important thing is that you have not stopped moving. I pulled onto the highway and headed north toward Birchwood Lane. It was still Friday. If this story moved you, if you've ever loved someone whose choices you couldn't understand, or been saved by someone you hadn't expected, share it with someone who needs to hear that forgiveness is a road, not a destination. And if you have a story of your own about love that held on when it had every reason to let go, leave it below. We read every single one. This has been my family story. Not the kind anyone chooses to tell, but the kind that, once it happens, refuses to stay silent. Looking back, I was a man who confused trust with wisdom. I believed that because I had built something with love, love would protect it. I believed that a father who gave everything had nothing left to fear from the person he gave it to. I was wrong, and the cost of being that wrong is not something I can measure in dollars or years or verdicts. So, let me say this plainly from one person to another: don't do what I did. Don't let love become blindness. Don't let loyalty silence the quiet voice that asks, is this person? Well, don't wait for proof before you ask the hard questions of the people you are closest to. Family betrayal rarely arrives as a sudden storm. It builds slowly in the ordinary weather of daily life until the day you realize you have been standing in it for years. I lived through family betrayal in the quietest, most invisible way possible, not with anger or confrontation, but with a bottle of vitamins set beside the pepper grinder, and a smile that never quite reached the eyes. I am not a perfect man. I made choices out of pride and habit and the deep human need to believe the best of the people we love. And I truly believe that God does not let those years go to waste, even the broken ones. Even the ones you would give anything to have back. This is a family story about what happens when the people we build our lives for turn that foundation against us. But it is also a story about the ones who hold the light when someone else is trying to take it away. A frightened man who finally chose to walk through a federal door. An agent who never forgot what his father told him. A woman who left a letter in a locked safe because she knew I would need it. Family betrayal can take many forms, but so can the love that outlasts it. I am still learning which kind I have left to give. Thank you for staying with me through this story all the way to the end. If you've ever faced a moment where love and betrayal lived in the same room, leave a comment and tell me what you would have done in Harold's place, a situation like this. I genuinely want to hear how you see it. If this family story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. A gentle note, while this story draws from real emotional experiences, universal family themes, certain elements have been shaped for narrative purposes. If this kind of content isn't for you, there are plenty of other stories on this channel waiting to find the right viewer.